Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear. Thank you. Not to worry.
Yes, I just wanted to confirm I have another county business event at 11 o'clock that I have to show up at.
Thank you. Then what we'll do, just to give everyone on the call a clear understanding, is my understanding as well is that Supervisor Cortese would like to see if we could take up item number 8 at the earliest opportunity. So in a minute, when we get to the approve the consent calendar and changes to the task force agenda, I will ask Supervisor Cortese if that is to his liking. So, Madam Clerk, or Mr. Clerk, or multi-clerks, however many clerks we have this morning, could we call the meeting to order and establish the presence of a quorum by a roll call, please?
Sure thing. Supervisor Cortese.
Here.
Present. Supervisor Simidian.
Simidian present.
Present. We have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And do we have public comment at this time?
There are no, we do have a public comment right now. We have a B. Beekman and a Sandy Perry currently.
Great. Thank you very much. And again, public comment is that portion of our agenda set aside for comment by members of the public on non-agendized items that are properly within the jurisdiction of the committee. So if your comments go to anything that is on our agenda, we would ask if you speak at that time, if at all possible. And because we do have a tight hour today, we'll ask our speakers to please keep their remarks as tight as possible, but you are allowed up to 3 minutes. Mr. Clerk, could you please call the first public speaker?
Next speaker is B. Beekman. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Go for it.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to thank Santa Clara County government and the Board of Supervisors for their good efforts and thought towards the better thinking of this society and human nature. It was hard fought to ensure that the census process of 2020 could create important standards of human rights and civil rights for whoever is in this country. I hope the good standards and good civil protections created for the 2020 census data can very much be applied to a more responsible democratic technology future. And from this, better democratic ideals can take place between city, county, state, and federal agencies, how to learn to organize and more openly share data. These are the data questions of people who are housed at county jail, to note COVID-19 labeling, to a new generation of people simply wanting better ideals and practices and protests at this time. Good luck in your continuing efforts. I feel the guideline process of Santa Clara County Surveillance and Technology Ordinance allows us to create responsible practices for the future of positive community sustainability. Thank you for your time. I had one more item. With all your data collection you'll be doing at this time, can you review what the practices you'll be having with the County of Santa Cruz and with the upcoming fire season? To review your practices with Santa Cruz County may be important, and I think it's important that I note that at this sort of meeting at this time. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, and if we could ask the clerk to call our next speaker under public comment, please.
The next and final speaker is Sandy Perry. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Yeah, this is Sandy Perry. Yeah, I can speak on it, item number 8. That's what my comments are for, item 8.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Perry. We'll call you again at that time. I'll ask the clerk to be mindful of your desire to speak at that point.
Thank you.
Then, if I can confirm with the clerk, that was the last of our speakers under public comment.
That was the last of the speakers.
That will take us to item number 3, which is to approve the consent calendar and any changes to the task force's agenda. And what I'm going to do is the only item we have under consent is to approve our minutes, Supervisor Cortese. But if we can get a motion to approve the consent calendar and one change to our task force agenda, which is that we would take up item number 8 immediately if possible, if we have the appropriate staff on the line. And if not, we'll ask staff to present that at the earliest opportunity during the meeting. Can I get a motion to that effect, Supervisor?
So moved.
Thank you, Supervisor Cortese. And without objection and hearing none, I will be the second. And that means the consent calendar stands approved. and that the agenda has been changed. And let me just confirm with the clerk that we had no speakers, forgive me, on the consent calendar.
No speakers on, oh, pardon me, we do. We have Cecilia Chavez.
Ms. Chavez, I'm just going to ask you, on the only item on the consent calendar is the minutes. So unless your comments are on the minutes, they may be better assigned to some specific topic on our agenda today. Go ahead, please.
I'll speak to item number 8, sorry.
No worries, thank you. I know these Zoom meetings can be a challenge, particularly if we rearrange the agenda. So then that does bring us to our regular agenda. And item number 8 is the verbal report from the Office of the County Executive relating to federal legislative action regarding housing policies in response to COVID-19, including rent abatement and mortgage forbearance. And let me just ask, is the County Executive's Office staff who is prepared to speak to this item on the Zoom meeting with us?
Supervisor, I think Rich Mead is going to give us an update from Prime Policy.
Thank you. And do we also have, we'll go to Rich Mead in a moment then. Do we have someone from County Counsel's office who can speak to this issue? I know we've received off agenda confidential memorandum from our County Counsel's office on some of these items.
Good morning, supervisors. This is Steve Mitra, Assistant County Counsel, and yes, I will attempt to speak to this issue.
All right, and I see you have Ms. Narayan with you as well, so it looks like we're well prepared. That being the case, then, Supervisor Cortese, I'm going to go to item number 8, and if you're agreeable, Supervisor Cortese, I think I would like to take public comment first. That might help frame some of the issues that we're going to discuss this morning. So, if I can go back to the clerk, thank the public for their patience. We'll go first to Mr. Perry, and then we'll go to Ms. Chavez, and then anyone else who is queued up to speak to item number 8, which by virtue of our agenda change is now the item before us. Thank you.
And just for clarity's sake, was this a 2-minute or a 3-minute? I'm sorry.
This is the 2-minute, which is the custom and practice of our board and committee when we have specific items for comment.
Thank you. We currently have 5 speakers in the queue. First up, Sandy Perry. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute. You will have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Sandy Perry from Affordable Housing Network and Cham Deliverance Ministry. Some of us came here today to ask for rent cancellation, rental assistance, or whatever is necessary to prevent what the New York Times recently called the avalanche of evictions that is bearing down on us, and it's definitely bearing down on us in this county. We're grateful to the supervisors and county officials for the shelter-in-place policies, the eviction moratoriums, the extension of the eviction moratorium, and pursuing extended repayment plans for back rent. And these are all helpful, but they still did not solve the problem. We were experiencing a shocking increase in homelessness before the pandemic, and that alone is the proof that a significant section of our people will not be able to pay back rent even after the pandemic is over and all of them return to work. 73% of the ELI renter households in San Jose are already severely cost burdened. That means they pay over half their income for rent, and that's before the pandemic. We cannot ask them to start paying 80 to 90%. It begins to become a physical impossibility. We support the HR 6515 by Representative Ilan Omar. We urge this committee to also support that bill. It's to cancel rent and mortgages. There's a bill that already passed the House for $100 billion in rental assistance. I mean, that's also good, but we're worried that that may exclude many of our Santa Clara County residents who need it most and maybe find it difficult to apply for. Many of our current assistance programs, people are having a hard time accessing. And so what we really support is the federal bill for rent cancellation. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Cecilia Chavez. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hello, and good morning. Thank you for having us.
Oh, sorry about
Go,
that.
go,
Sorry
go
about
right
that.
ahead, Ms. Javish.
Okay. Am I good now?
You're good. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'll be brief. I want to talk more about the personal experience of why looking into solutions for renters, and not just renters, for landlords as well. I think a solution for everyone is super important. As an organizer and as a tenant myself, I could already seeing what landlords are doing because of the necessity, because of having to pay those mortgages. As a renter myself, we've been able to stay afloat. We've been paying our rent, but we see that our landlord is struggling because his job was affected. So we want to look for a solution that helps for everyone. And I thank this committee for looking into different alternatives that supports everyone, different types of rental assistance, whatever it's being called. We really appreciate it because we don't want anyone to be left out. Something I do want to bring up is to not forget about the immigrant community. There's a lot of us who don't even have rental agreements, that are renting rooms in one house, that sublease. So just thinking about all of the people, and when we're thinking about what does rental support really look like for everyone, let's include the undocumented community as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. And let me look to the clerk to recognize our next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Janet Diaz-Perez. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute. You'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hi, my name is Janet Diaz. I'm a patient business services clerk at Valley Medical Center and the president of chapter of SEIU Local 521. I want to work together to resist the call for austerity as a way to deal with our budget deficits. We know this will be a hard task, but we believe we have no other choice if we want to live up to our shared vision of a just society. We know that austerity will only continue to hurt everyone who relies on public services and the most vulnerable, such as the unemployed, the unhoused, uninsured, low-income people of color, and immigrants. If any state and county in this country can choose a different route, we believe it is California and Santa Clara County. At this point, SEIU has taken the lead in a statewide effort that we are calling Invest in a Healthy Future Now. It starts with securing new resources for funding, and it could trickle down as to the county level in keeping the teleworking, as well as making sure that the staffing of the contact tracing our county employees as a way to save money versus outsourcing for the contact tracing. And as far as the green emissions and everything that entails with the teleworking, as many of us are already set up in doing so. I ask that the county join us in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And I'll ask the clerk to note, I think the comments from Ms. Diaz-Perez were actually on item number 7. So when we get to that item, we'll have to consider her having already spoken to that item. If there are others at the time, we'll note that as well. All right. Who's our next speaker on item number 8?
Next speaker is Charisse Domingo. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute. You'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hi, good morning. My name is Charisse Domingo. I'm an organizer with Silicon Valley Debug. I'm speaking today because one of my other colleagues, Crystal, will also be presenting a letter that we submitted yesterday, and we also submitted this morning, indicating that there's community-wide support here in Santa Clara County from a variety of organizations urging the county to cancel rent. I know this is a federal affairs committee, but what I would suggest as you deliberate on this issue is that as the eviction moratorium is great, and you all extended it yesterday, which is amazing. What it does, though, is that it just holds back the floodgates of evictions. We're seeing many tenants reaching out to debug every week at our participatory defense meetings who are at the brink of being evicted, of being homeless, because they can't afford to pay rent, whether it's now, whether it's months from now. And so the proposal that we're asking is to create a program to cancel rent under HR 6515, but our own version. And so we asked if we could direct staff to see if there's any kind of funds available to be able to do that here in our community. The HR 6515 does cancel rent, but it also creates a landlord relief fund so that the burden of proof of all these evictions could be on the landlords who could access this funding. So I hope you could consider that today. And we as DBUG are down to support and are down to be partners in this as we think through this process for our community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me look to the clerk to see if we have additional speakers.
We do indeed. I believe there are 5 speakers left. Crystal Olivas is the next speaker. I am
And
unmuting you.
Before we get to Ms. Olivas, I'm going to ask that we stop after those 5. And I'm sorry, folks, if you want to stick around, we'll hear you at the end. But we do need to actually hear from our speakers and then get to these items, since we have a member who has to go into another meeting at 11. So we'll take 5 more speakers at this time. If there are others still on the meeting call at the end, happy to hear them. But I want to make sure we get to the action on the item, if any. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Sure. Just for note, we have Liz Gonzalez, Andrew, Mary Helen Doherty, and Marilyn Mara. That will be the next group, the final group. Crystal Olivas, you're next. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute, and you'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Good morning. My name is Crystal Olivas. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm a community organizer with DBUG. I also coordinate a rental assistance program at YWCA, and I am a tenant. Thank you for enacting the shelter in place, and also for ordering the eviction moratorium and for the extension, as it has provided some protections to tenants. However, we have seen that it is not enough, and it leaves tenants in a precarious situation of accruing rent debt during this crisis, many who were already in very vulnerable positions. And we have also seen that there's a lack of clarity around the moratorium, and unfortunately, there have been landlords that are taking advantage of this. As Charisse mentioned earlier, there is broad community support to cancel rent. And we see this through the letter that we submitted to the Board of Supervisors and that we recently submitted to this task force. It has been signed by various community organizations that are really concerned about what is going to happen to families here. And so we really ask you and hope that this task force can seek funds to support canceling rent through a landlord relief fund. It is something that is really needed. A lot of families don't know what is going to happen. And as I've mentioned, it really leaves people in a situation of, through no fault of their own, in 6 months, a year, they're going to have this huge rent debt. So we thank you again for allowing us to speak, and we really urge you to look into this and to seek the funds to cancel rent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Liz Gonzalez. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute. You'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you. My name is Liz Gonzalez. I'm with Silicon Valley DBUG as well. And we'd like to appreciate Supervisor Cortese for bringing this issue to the task force and recognizing the urgency. We'd like to ask if this committee can direct staff to reach out to our representatives like Ro Khanna to advocate for this, perhaps within the HEROES Act or other legislation. Can staff reach out to Ilhan Omar's office to find ways to get rental assistance directly, not just through the state or city, but something that allows us to set up our own version here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I should have just noted earlier for the record that Tom Pike, who is the district director for Congressman Ro Khanna, has joined us at this meeting, as is his custom. We appreciate both his presence and the willingness of Congressman Khanna to share him with us at each of these meetings. So I do want to let folks know that he is on the call, on the meeting, and is hearing you loud and clear. Thank you.
The next speaker is Andrew. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hey everyone, my name is Andrew Bigelow. I am an organizer with Silicon Valley Debug, but I'm also a tenant and have a family and we rent a little apartment in San Jose. I just wanted to echo kind of all the things that have already been said by some of my fellow organizers, and also want to again say thank you for the moratorium and really just trying to express the gratitude for how important it is that people have that right now, and trying to express the importance of what it's going to mean to pass some sort of legislation or program or rental assistance like the one that's being talked about right now. It's of equal, if not greater, importance. And just like some of the folks were saying, in the meetings that we've been having, and families have been coming to our meetings who are struggling to pay rent, can't pay rent, and there's definitely a lack of clarity of what can and can't happen, and something to really draw clear lines as to what's allowed and what's not, such as like repayment plans. There's so many tenants who are being forced into repayment plans, and because there's no direction as to what's going to happen with this debt. So once again, just want to encourage this task force to look into how can we, as a leading county in this country, to develop a local version of HR 6515 and create the rental assistance and have it be clear and mandatory for folks who are struggling to pay rent, that their landlords participate in it. Yeah, thank you.
Our next speaker is Mary Helen Doherty. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Thank you. My name is Mary Helen Doherty. I'm speaking here to you on behalf of my engagement with the housing team of PACT and also with Serge showing up for Sacred Heart. We want to raise our voice on behalf of our tenants, like the others have spoken to, and especially our undocumented neighbors, and underscore the testimony that SV Debug has just presented in a very articulate way. We also want to express our thanks to the board and to all the work you've done so far to really acknowledge the hardship that the pandemic is having on our tenants and so many folks in the community. We also echo our support for HR 6515. So in the interest of time, I will end my remarks there, but thank you for any work that you can do, and please do your best in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our final speaker is Anna Naranjo. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Buenos días, yo solo hablo español, pero me gustaría dar mi testimonio para que vean el impacto de lo que está pasando con las familias que somos más de bajos ingresos. Las familias que vivimos día al día, no podemos pagar la renta y hemos vivido con el acoso de los dueños día con día, y eso ha causado trauma emocional en toda nuestra familia, nuestros hijos. Tenemos algunos gentes, familias enfermas aquí con nosotros. No podemos comprar incluso comida porque no tenemos dinero. Hemos reducido gastos y los costos que nos han pagado, nos han cortado el cable, nos han cortado la luz, nos han cortado los esencial para sobrevivir. Y por favor, ayúdenos a nuestras familias, ayuden a las familias que día con día y no tienen trabajo ahorita.
Un momentito, por favor. Let me ask the clerk, do we have anyone who can provide translation services?
No one at this time.
All right. After the meeting is over, let's see if we can get someone to translate and give us a transcript of the testimony. Let's ask our speaker to continue.
Muchas gracias. Por favor, consideren a los que no tenemos seguro, los que no tenemos desempleo, los que no podemos proveer comida a la familia, los que no podemos pagar la renta, la luz, todos los gastos que tiene la familia para sobrevivir ahorita. Es demasiado difícil. Yo sé que para todos y también para los dueños. Debe de haber una manera de salir adelante todos. Y nosotros necesitamos la ayuda de todos ustedes. Necesitamos la ayuda del pueblo. Necesitamos sobrevivir, que es lo esencial. Y muchas gracias por escuchar y por favor, otra vez, ayuden a las familias que somos indocumentados, que no tenemos esas seguros ni nada para poder apoyar a las familias. Gracias.
Thank you. Gracias. Lo siento, pero mi español muy mal. We will ask the clerk to be mindful of the need to make sure we get a translation shared with both members of the committee after the meeting is over. Was that our final speaker on this item?
We did have Chris Rios raise his hand when you mentioned a request for a translator. I'm not sure if that is a volunteer to translate, but someone did raise their hand in response.
All right, I want to make sure we have time to respond to the testimony this morning. So let's just make sure we do that after the fact and see if in future, if there is a translation need for those who are listening, if you can let us know in advance, that of course will help. I understand that that's not always possible. So we'll work with the clerk to make sure we have translation services available whenever possible. Thank you again, everybody, for understanding and doing the best we can with our technology this morning. Was that our fifth speaker of the five?
That was indeed the final speaker.
Thank you to the clerk. For anyone else who wishes to speak, please know that you will be heard later in the meeting if you wish when we make our way through these other items. But I do want to make sure that if there's action to be taken and or reports to be given, that we get those in while Supervisor Cortese and I are both present for the meeting. So I think now Supervisor Cortese would be a good time for me to turn to Rich Mead from Prime Policy to fill us in on federal legislation at this time. Is that agreeable to you, sir? I think
yes, that would be great. That would be great.
Thanks. Mr. Mead, go right ahead, and thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Smithian. You will recall that at our last meeting, I reported on the so-called CARES Act that signed the law in March, and that had a few housing provisions I think are of interest to the county. Number one, there's a foreclosure moratorium, which ran for 60 days, and that has since expired. However, there's also provision that allowed borrowers to seek two 180-day forbearance periods from their lender. There is also a 120-day eviction moratorium that runs until the end of July. Those provisions, however, were only related to those mortgages that had a nexus with the federal government, meaning they were guaranteed and securitized by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, or came from a direct housing program from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or the USDA, or other federal housing programs. Since then, though, the House has passed the so-called HEROES Act, and there are four provisions, housing provisions in the HEROES Act that I think will be of interest to the county. Number one, there's an emergency rental assistance program, and this adds $100 billion to the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act for emergency solution grants to states to provide some short to medium-term assistance for rent, utility, and deposits. To be eligible for funds from this program, your income has to be below 80% of the median income, which is about $100,000 for Santa Clara County. and 40% of those funds have to be dedicated to those individuals below 30% of the median income, and overall 70% of funds has to be dedicated to households with 50% of the median income in the county. The maximum amount of those grants is 120% of the fair market rent established by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And for Santa Clara County, let me briefly touch upon those amounts. That'd be $2,523 for an efficiency, $2,949 for a one bedroom, $3,564 for a two bedroom, $4,731 for a three bedroom, and $5,430 for a four bedroom. The law also has some set-asides for tribes and the territories. That's the first program. The second program is the Homeowner Assistance Fund, which is established at the Department of Treasury with $75 billion. And this allows state housing authorities to submit plans for how to provide financial assistance to homeowners. And they can use it to either pay their mortgage or to pay down their principal or pay down interest in order to lower their monthly amount. Taxes and insurance can also be covered with funds from this program. And 60% of the funds must be dedicated to individuals with incomes less than 80% of the median income. And again, that's about $100,000 in Santa Clara County. The third program is a protection from evictions. And unlike the CARES Act, the HEROES Act does not have the nexus between the mortgages having a nexus with the federal government. This applies pretty much across the board to all mortgages. And this is a 12-month protection from evictions from the date of enactment of the law, which we expect will likely be sometime in July. The dwellings that are covered by this provision are defined by Section 802 of the Fair Housing Act, which is a very broad definition. It also includes a 6-month prohibition on repossessing vehicles used as homes, so whether that's a car or a recreational vehicle. And they also have, as part of this protection, some assistance for the owners of these properties with some forbearance on automatic 60 days, and then the ability to extend it up to 360 days for the owners of these properties. And they also allow that the repayments for the forbearance can be extended up to 10 years. It also provides some liability protection for the servicers of these loans in terms of protections against the investors or those who have invested in the loan, so that the servicers aren't held liable. And then finally, there's the fourth program is a liquidity program for rental property owners, and this directs the Federal Reserve to set up a lending facility using the monies from the CARES Act to defer payments on the loans for up to 6 months. So those are the four main provisions that were in the HEROES Act that again passed the House the week before Memorial Day. Many of the witnesses spoke to the bill HR 6515, which has been introduced, and that allows for rent and mortgage payments to not be paid during this Stafford Act emergency declaration. So long as that emergency declaration is in effect, the renters and homeowners would not have to make those payments. And as part of that, there's also a landlord relief fund to help the owners of the rental properties. The bill has about 30 co-sponsors on it at this time. There's also standalone legislation from Senator Sherrod Brown and Derek Kilmer that more closely tracks what was in the HEROES Act. So with that, why don't I pause for any questions or discussion?
Thank you. Let me suggest, Mr. Cortese, that we go to Steve Mitra from our county counsel's office, because as you know, they've provided some legal analysis on what our county can or cannot do directly. Is that agreeable to you, sir?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mitra, if you and your team could weigh in on some of these issues and help Supervisor Cortese and I, but also the public for that matter, have an understanding of what you all think we have and don't have in the way of discretion, I think this would be helpful.
Good morning, supervisors. As the community and everyone present probably is aware, this county has been very progressive and on the forefront of protecting tenants by instituting an eviction moratorium, and just yesterday enlarging the period for repayment of past due rent to a year, and then on top of that, to ensure that landlords provide tenants with notice of their repayment rights. So this county has been doing a lot, and the board has been doing a lot. Additional measures that have come up are of the sort that have been described today and generally fall under the category of rent cancellation. And, you know, we have concerns about those types of provisions because unlike eviction moratoria that have the effect of keeping people in their place and allowing compliance with the shelter-in-place orders, the rent cancellation and other measures of that type are more sort of in the realm of police power, rent regulation, and those are vulnerable to constitutional claims such as takings claims, contract clause claims, also preemption at the state level. Just in general, those are much higher risk, and we have concerns about the county going there.
Thank you. Understood. Just so that both our committee, the task force care, and the public are mindful, all of those cautions you've just shared with us are offered, notwithstanding the fact that you have reviewed the letter from the Law Foundation on this topic. Yes.
That's correct.
Okay, I wanted to let folks know that we had received that letter, and I've had a chance to review it, and I don't know about Supervisor Cortese, but I'm guessing he has as well, and that was in part the basis. Go ahead, Supervisor Cortese. I know it's a little hard to interact on our Zoom call here.
Yes, I've reviewed it also and had an opportunity actually to be on a Zoom call with Mr. Mitra and some advocates that want, particularly from the Law Foundation, that were wanting to talk about it a little bit more. So I feel pretty well versed in it. And as of course, both you and I have enough legal background to understand, the basic principles, as well as having been in local government for a long time dealing with issues like takings. So we understand the risk there. I do commend the Law Foundation for, pushing the envelope and trying to look at how far could you stretch if you were trying to be bold, the issue of temporary versus, any kind of a permanent taking. But I'm more intrigued with, what might come out of the HEROES Act or some version of it. I guess the three questions I have is, the notion that some version of the HEROES Act might take effect July 1st, which is what a federal lobbyist was saying. I'm not sure how optimistic he or anyone is of that, but if there's optimism there, that would be good. I think it'd probably be good for the people who testified today to hear, how we're handicapping at this point, getting some kind of a HEROES Act out of Congress. Secondly, I'm just curious about implementation, particularly on the landlord and mortgage relief side. It's, again, particularly intriguing because that takes away any kind of a takings question. And it seems like one of those few areas of win-win between landlords and tenants. I don't think most landlords really care where the payment comes from, as long as they get their payment and they're whole. And most tenants don't really care where the payment comes from, as long as, it's coming from somewhere when they, when they're struggling and unemployed. So it sounds like somebody's trying to take a thoughtful approach at the congressional level, but would that be implemented likely through SBA or the conduit that we have here, which is the Small Business Development Center, which the county helped re-stand up a few years ago? They've been dealing with the CARES Act money that goes to businesses, and I'm just wondering if our Washington representatives have any further insight on that, or if that's all speculation at this point.
Mr. Mead, can you help us out there?
Yes, and my apologies. I forgot to give my outlook at the end of my presentation. So I think it's safe to say that the final version of the HEROES Act will probably be less generous than what passed the House. So we're talking about $175 billion appropriated for those relief programs. It's probably going to be somewhat lower than that level, number one. Number two, having said that, though, the CARES Act that passed had 3 housing protection provisions negotiated on a bipartisan basis. So I think it's safe to say that there should be some relief in the final version of the HEROES Act for renters and homeowners and landlords. We don't know the exact specifics of what that will be. In terms of the administration of the program, it looks as though they're probably going to run these through Treasury, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, in partnership and in coordination with the state housing authorities. So the California Housing Authority would probably have a large say in how it's implemented in California.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair Simonian. I don't have any other questions, although I'd be interested in any thoughts you have in preparatory work that we might want to recommend, probably through the full board at some point, in terms of getting ready for implementation, or our fair share and communication with the state and so forth. It just strikes me that July 1st is going to be here pretty quick. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go back to Mr. Mitra and our legal team with a question, if I may, which is, Mr. Mitra, I think one of the things that's been challenging for all of us, but particularly for members of the public who are struggling to figure out which level of government can be helpful with which part of the challenge, is sorting out who has authority to do what. I'm curious to know if any of the concerns that you have identified that might limit or prohibit action by our county might not be an impediment if the action was taken at some other level of government, either the state, but even at our city level here in Santa Clara County. Do cities have more leeway on some of these issues and or the state, in your assessment?
My understanding is that a takings claim can be pursued against the cities or the state and even the federal government, frankly. But I will say that the takings analysis is a very fact-specific analysis. So to the point that had been made earlier, if there's foreclosure or mortgage relief on the one side protecting landlords, then that would have to be figured into the analysis to kind of see if it still results in a taking. It's complicated to do so because it is very fact specific.
Thank you. And let me ask Ms. Christian, who's on the line with us, I know from our own government relations office, as Supervisor Cortese has referenced, forgive me, the lights just went out in my North County office. As Supervisor Cortese has referenced, it sounds like from what Mr. Mead had to say, much of this would be driven at the state level. Your thoughts about how we might best interact with the state to make sure that we're teed up in a timely basis for any local access or application?
Yes, I think we could reach out to the members of our delegation, and then also with our partners, other stakeholders such as the California State Association of Counties, to connect with the appropriate state agency and see what we can do to be as ready as possible.
Thank you for that. I don't think that requires formal direction, Supervisor Cortese, but I think you and I are both suggesting that we'd like to make sure that our county is ahead of the curve and engaged both in early conversations about how such funds might be appropriately distributed or relief shared, and then also ready from moment one to effectuate such relief if and when it's forthcoming at the federal level. Does that fairly capture what you were hoping for a moment or two ago?
Yes, and maybe some work on the metrics too. I know you were asking some questions about it in the past, which I thought was a good line of questioning regarding, what's the range of impact here in terms of need? And I think that would be very important to have. I know you have the direct state experience legislatively, but it seems to me, with my experience at the regional level dealing with housing and transportation, once the state is designated as the repository for federal dollars, they tend to adopt a formula based on something, and it's supposed to be based on need, of course, or need based on population. But if our staff could, in the spirit of COVID, do a little work in terms of what do these numbers really look like? What are they likely to look like in a month or two? Just projections that can help arm us to argue with the California Housing Department, persuade may be a better term than argue, that we need our fair share. I think it's pretty tough to make that argument if you don't know what your fair share is or should be. So I just think some homework on that would be, besides contacting our delegation and doing the sort of political lobbying, that we should also be prepared to throw some numbers around. There's no other agency around here that's going to do that for us. It's going to have to be us, I think.
Thank you. Mr. Mead, if we can circle back to you and your colleagues at Prime, there was reference obviously to, and you made reference yourself to HR 6515, and I think you said it had roughly 30 co-sponsors. What's the handicapping on that legislation? What are its prospects in understanding that that's an uncertain business in terms of trying to predict what's likely to happen legislatively?
And I'll start and let my colleagues jump in to add additional color. While it's good that it has 30 co-sponsors, it's not insignificant on the one hand. On the other hand, the tack taken with that bill 6515 was not reflected in the HEROES Act, nor in the Speaker Pelosi's sort of response initially to the CARES Act. So it has a steeper hill to climb than the provisions in the HEROES Act. I think that's probably the best way to describe it.
Got it. Anything else from either Ms. Graff or Ms. Thompson, who I know are also on the call with us this morning from Prime? And if not, I just wanted to make sure we didn't roll through this issue too quickly.
No, that's.
No, I think Rich gave a great overview, a very comprehensive one. I think the thing that's good about the bill that we were just talking about, whether or not that was the exact model that had been incorporated into the HEROES Act or not, but all of these legislation, all of these different pieces of legislation and the number of co-sponsors, I think that what they demonstrate is that there is a real awareness of these issues and a desire to figure out some sort of approach to get at whatever the best approach is to get at addressing them. So I still think it's, sort of a feather in the cap of the issue, if you will.
Thank you. And I want to just follow up with a question because this has been a sort of a recurring question as every effort to address the challenge has been made. Is the legislative action that is the conversation in Washington sort of focused on across the board relief for sort of the general public, all parties, or is it focused more on individuals who in some way, shape, or form are able to demonstrate that they have been damaged by the crisis? And I'll let Mr. Mead start and then see, since his light went on, but we'll also see if Ms. Graff or Ms. Thompson have comments. Mr. Mead?
I think that the most of the efforts, most of the attention, quite honestly, are on assistance for those who can show or have been impacted by the COVID pandemic. And so we're seeing this in the implementation of the CARES Act, where, for example, the monies that were appropriated for healthcare providers, the Department of Health and Human Services is taking great efforts to try to target those to those who are most impacted by the disease. So I think that's the general sentiment, is try to target this relief to those affected by COVID.
Ms. Graff, Ms. Thompson, anything else on that particular question?
No, I concur with Rich.
Thanks. Supervisor Cortese, I know you have to be in another meeting here in about 5-6 minutes. I want to see if there's anything else you either want to ask or say so that we get as much of your input as you care to provide before you have to roll into your next obligation.
Not really. Again, I agree with you at this moment, given the guidance or direction in the line of questioning from the committee itself, I think, or the task force. I think everyone knows what our expectations are in terms of being prepared. And, you know, I would just urge the staff, whether it's got county council side or whether it's Danielle Christian's side or whether it's just purely administrative county executive side, not to you know, let any grass grow under our feet in terms of bringing a ledge file to the Board of Supervisors with or without further direction if they see that we need to do something to create our own repository for federal dollars to get them on the street quickly. I really think of, in so many of the reimbursement programs that we've been looking at thus far from the federal level, where we kind of have the luxury of saying, let's spend, you know, and then we hope we're going to get reimbursed. We think we're going to get reimbursed. That's the age-old way of doing it. I think with this, there's going to be a lot more pressure, perhaps, to get money out on the street quickly. Not that there isn't with other things, but the pressure is going to be. I believe that the scale here is beyond what we could do with the general fund. So we're really going to have to know how quickly can we ramp up, get dollars out there with some assurance that we have deposits coming in, whether they're funneled through the state or whatever. So all that in our language just means get us a ledge file as soon as you need to. Let's not wait around. Thank you. That's all I have, and I'll sign off. I'm sorry. I won't really miss the rest of the meeting because we, of course, I've read my packet, but we've also have staff covering the video, and I'll go back and make sure I pick up on anything else today. But thank you for. Yeah.
Excuse the interruption. Before you sign off, just as a process matter, it's imperfect, but if I could ask you for a motion to receive the reports in items 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8, the one we just did, that will allow us to clear the books from a parliamentary standpoint. Are you comfortable with making such a motion at this point? I will stay and continue to listen on these items. So we have a motion from, without objection, a second from Simidian, and for the clerk's records, items 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are deemed received. And thank you for that, Supervisor Cortese. And again,
and
for those who go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just want to say, and for the record, I have reviewed those items. So the motion is certainly in order. Thank you.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Have a good day. Then for the clerk and for the public, that would take us under the ordinary course of business to item number 4, meeting now as a committee of the whole, to receive verbal reports from the chair and the vice chair. Nothing to report there. That does, however, take us to item number 5, which is to receive the verbal report from the Office of the County Executive relating to items of interest to the task force, obviously in connection with federal affairs. Let me just ask Dr. Smith and his office if there's anything to report there. Dr. Smith, either you or Ms. Christian or Mr. Preminger or whoever else you might want to point to at this time. Any comments?
I'll turn it over to Danielle, but I think our only presentation is from Prime Policy and from Bert Morgolin.
Okay.
This is Danielle Christian. Dr. Smith is correct. The bulk of the updates are going to be captured in the item that you just heard and then in item number 7.
Thank you very much. We'll get to item number 7 very quickly, obviously. Let me go to County Counsel again, then on item number 6. And I'll just say to the clerk, if there are speakers along the way, please interrupt me and let me know. I will take at the very end of the meeting additional speakers if there are any remaining on item number 8.
I have 3 in the queue now. 3 speakers.
They're in the queue for which item, please?
Well, we currently would be item 6. I think that's the item we're on now, but I have no way to ask them individually.
All right, why don't we do this then? Before we go to County Counsel, let's go ahead and hear from folks who are queued up and ask them if they could please, I know, again, it's a bit of a struggle with our Zoom conferences, to identify which item number they are speaking on. So who is our next speaker? Looking to the clerk.
Catherine Hedges is our next speaker. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm very concerned that we will have a wave of evictions if we don't find a way to have some kind of rent forgiveness for people who are most affected by the COVID-19. I couldn't quite hear all of the discussion that just happened, but I hope that there can be some type of rent forgiveness, even if it's something that people have to apply for and qualify for with more restrictions than the eviction moratorium, because people have more time to go through a process. And this is just so important for our community because so many people don't have income coming in. People have lost more with the Fed uprising this past week. And I hope that the county can pass something. I'm so lucky that I'm on disability and I have a steady income. I have an affordable housing landlord, and I feel so bad for the people who constantly have to worry about whether they're going to have a place to live or not. And as a member of PAC, I've been working on affordable housing and tenant rights for a couple of years now, and I hope we can keep everything from falling apart for people's housing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Let's ask the clerk to take our next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Chris Rios. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hello there, my name is Chris Rios, and I'm a resident and a registered voter here in Milpitas. And I want to give you some background on myself. I'm a first-generation college student here at Stanford University. My background is in computer science and human biology. So first, I want to commend the County Council for the moratorium on evictions and the extension of that moratorium. You have acted when other individual cities have failed to act, and this moratorium has no doubt saved uncountable numbers of lives by preventing a rampant community infection. So understand that this pandemic is not over. This is an ongoing international health concern, and people are no longer hurting, they are suffering. Constituents are suffering. It is an unrealistic, unproductive, and an inhumane right now for people to be attacking renters at this time, to be demanding repayment of rent, to be forcing them into stipulation agreements. I'm hearing stories of landlords demanding that tenants sign agreements that demand that they make payment of rent along with interest, along with a shorter timeline that is manageable. You have the power and the capacity to adopt a policy that will cancel rent and mortgages for renters and small landlords. This is well within your constitutional power and has been stated by numerous lawyers from the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley. You have that power and you need to act on that power. Without the cancellation of rent, we will be looking at the greatest wave of homelessness in Santa Clara County in all of its existence. This will only exacerbate our concerns of community infection. This will lead to death. This will lead to unmitigated infection and will cause far more harm than outright forgiving rent. It is not enough to defer payment. Payment must be forgiven. And from an economic standpoint, it makes sense. People will be able to put money back into the local markets. Forgiveness of rent will also benefit mortgages of small landlords. And in the end, we will see a reduction and the need for civil services across the next year as people continue to shelter in place. We're not seeing people driving. We're not seeing people go out. And so there's a less of a need for funds that are normally gained from taxes on property. We need to manage that budget accordingly. Moreover, taxpayers should not, in essence, bail out billion-dollar landlords and conglomerates. Rather, they need to outright cancel rent. That is what is necessary.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Final speaker in the queue is B. Beekman. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear,
Indeed.
sir.
Thank you, thank you. I wanted to comment on item 5, which was kind of an overview of questions of the federal task force at this time, what items they'll be taking on, I think. I just wanted to, yes, I wanted to comment on item 5 that I feel you're doing a very, it's a very interesting task force committee that you have here. And you did a very good job today in informing me what is actually going on at the federal level with actual programs. To know what the HEROES Act can be doing for renters and owners alike is really important to me at this time. And that can now give me choices how to talk to state agencies and federal government, you know, about what can they do to add on to help that's needed. What the previous caller said, you know, we have good beginnings. How do we ask for better? You know, how do we make those steps? And it needs to be an open process. And that's what you're doing here today. And it has to be open. We can't have closed conversations about these subjects. And just to make it open and available to everyone so they know what choices they have and what is the responsibility of owners to explain to tenants at this time. That's important stuff. And I thank you for working on it. And oh, I had one other issue. I wanted to be able to bring up in the future whistleblower protection ideas to the task force and how that relates to data collection issues. I hope you can make it a space where you can talk about data collection issues for the federal task force committee here. I think that would be a great place to do that. And yeah, that's my comments on this good idea of the federal task force committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just confirm with the clerk that it was the last of the speakers in our queue.
We had one late arrival, one more remaining. Anil Babar.
Thank you.
You have 2 minutes to speak. I'm unmuting you, and the timer will start when you begin speaking.
Thank you for allowing me to speak today. Anil Babar with the California Apartment Association. I want to highlight legislation that's at the state level that addresses the goals that the committee is trying to address today, and that is SB 1410. I think this is a more realistic route at the current moment to pursue. I know this is the Federal Affairs Committee, but SB 1410, what it essentially does is provide vouchers to tenants who are struggling to pay their rent at 80% of what their rent is, so long as the other 20% is forgiven for a temporary period of time. I think the state can really be in a better position to offer these funds because due to the unknown status of anything going on at the federal level. So I would urge the committee to make a motion to have the full board take a position on SB 1410. It cleared the Senate Housing Committee recently, and it's scheduled to go to the House Appropriations Committee on June 6th. So again, SB 1410 is something I think would be a much better route to take than, or much more realistic route to take at the moment. Thank you.
Mr. Babar, before you step away, could you tell us the author of SB 1410, please? Senator who?
Sure. It's Ana Caballero. Senator Ana Caballero is the principal sponsor of the bill at the moment.
Thank you very much. Now let me go back to the clerk and make sure we don't have anyone left hanging in the queue at the moment.
There is no one left in the queue.
All right, thank you. Then we will consider both items 4 and 5, as I say, already received. Item 6, which we were about to address before we went back to catch the speakers, is up next. So let me just go to County Counsel. And Ms. Narayan, are you providing that update today? We have a brief pause here. There we go.
Oh, okay. Am I audible? I don't have a great cell connection at home.
You are loud and clear, Ms. Narayan. Are you providing the update for County Council on item number 6 today?
I am, yes.
Thank you. We do have the 69-page report, so I have some sense of just how many areas your office has been engaged in. But are there particular developments in the last month since we since we last met that you think it would be appropriate to highlight?
Just two short ones. The first is that in the DACA case that's before the Supreme Court, we expect a ruling this month in June. The second update is that in the slew of cases around the country challenging the Burn JAG grant conditions that require local governments to cooperate with immigration enforcement in order to receive law enforcement funding, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in the Midwest recently upheld an order enjoining those grant conditions from being applied not only for prior grant years, but for all future grant years. So that issue continues to percolate throughout the federal courts across the country, with both sides, meaning the federal government and then the local governments that don't agree with the conditions, continuing to challenge and take all the cases up to the highest level. With that, I am happy to submit on the written document unless you have further questions for me.
I think the one follow-up question is on the DACA litigation, which you indicate we may hear from soon. What are the possible outcomes / impacts of that case? So what should we be thinking? Well, this might happen, that might happen. This may be required in the way of a response, or that might be required in the way of response. Could you tease that out a little bit more, please?
Sure. I think that most commentators expect a 5-4 decision, but are not sure on which way it will go in terms of whether the Trump administration's decision to rescind the DACA program was lawful or not. If the Supreme Court were to rule that rescission was not lawful, then the DACA program as it existed under the Obama administration would be reinstated. As far as what that means for the administrative processing of applications that may have been submitted in the interim but could not be because of the federal government's new rule, I think those intricacies I don't feel well equipped to speak on. I think my best guess would be that if the court were to rule that the rescission of DACA was unlawful, it would have to remand back to the lower court for further proceedings on those kinds of administrative questions. So my expectation would be, even if there is a positive resolution in terms of the county's interest in the matter, that it won't end there.
If, on the other hand, it went in the other direction, help us think through the consequences there.
Sure. Then the rescission of the DACA program would be upheld. I would think that in the way that since the program was rescinded, there have been limited acceptances of renewal applications from persons who previously had DACA and were able to obtain renewals, but no new applications being accepted. My expectation is that anyone who currently has a grant of DACA, it would not immediately be terminated, but would rather be allowed to live out to the end of its 2 years, but thereafter they would no longer be able to apply. Again, those are the administrative details that I don't feel certain of, but that would be my expectation.
Thank you. And let me just turn to the folks at Prime and see, understanding that this is our legal report, but if there are comments or observations that folks in Washington could share that are illuminating, we'd love to hear them. I see Mr. Mead's microphone is open again. Mr. Mead?
I'll start and let my colleagues add to what I say. And I think that the expectation in Washington is if the Supreme Court upholds what the Trump administration has done with the DACA program, I think there's a fairly strong likelihood that you could see legislation in this area emerge. I think there's bipartisan support for maintaining some version of the DACA program on some levels, and I think that you could see consensus potentially emerge in Congress on legislation.
Mr. Mead, I'm going to try and put words in your mouth, and if they're not the right words, you'll let me know. Okay, fair enough.
Yes.
I know from prior visits to Washington myself and meetings with members of Congress that I've had with prior delegations, the sense I picked up and that I think you're reinforcing is that there may well be bipartisan support to find what I just characterize as an equitable solution to the DACA beneficiaries, but that Congress, frankly, has not had the political will to step up and challenge it until and unless they have to by virtue of court action. Is that a fair summary of your read, or did I miss something there?
No, that's a fair summary.
Yeah, I think, and I don't say this critically of Congress, I just say it matter-of-factly, I think it's an issue that folks in Congress, as I've spoken to them, see as a challenging one, an important one, but one that they're not going to be ready to tackle until and unless they have to. And ultimately, a decision by the court may be the thing that says, all right, Congress has to step up and wrestle this one to the ground. All right. Then I will say thank you to all on this, including the County Counsel's office, and for the clerk, by virtue of our earlier motion from Supervisor Cortese, which I seconded, the report on item number 6 will be deemed received. That takes us to item number 7, which is the report from the Office of the County Executive relating to federal legislative action in response to the COVID-19, including House Resolution 266, the Paycheck Protection Program, and the Healthcare Enhancement Act, which allocated funding for COVID-19 testing and laboratory capacity and contact tracing. Ms. Christian, do I look to you to be the sort of air traffic controller who helps all of these folks on the Zoom chart land safely at their time?
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to start with some brief comments. At the last Federal Affairs Advocacy Task Force, we provided a report on the 4 federal bills that had been enacted so far that provide nearly $3 trillion in response to the coronavirus pandemic. We also discussed some House activities to put together another package, the HEROES Act, which has been referenced in great part in earlier parts of this meeting. At the committee, or at the task force's direction, the county did send a letter to our delegation that outlined our priorities and identified gaps for their consideration and inclusion in a new package. Crime Policy Group is going to provide an update on where things currently stand in Congress, where we can expect, what we can expect to happen next, and then information on key provisions of interest in the HEROES Act. And then following their presentation, Bert Margolin from the Margolin Group will provide information on the key healthcare provisions that were included in the HEROES Act, as well as talk about the funding that was included in the last bill passed by Congress, House Resolution 266, related to lab capacity, COVID-19 testing, and contact tracing. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Crime Policy Group to begin their presentation.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. This is Erin Griffey. I will go ahead and focus my remarks on the federal response, excluding what has already been discussed under item 8. And then we'll, of course, leave the healthcare comments to Mr. Margolin, who will come after me.
Ms. Griffey, before you proceed,
Yes.
have I been mispronouncing your name for the last 2 years?
That's fine. Everyone does. Just
well, with a name like Sabinian, I'm empathetic. Let's put it that way. I'll try and do better.
I barely noticed, trust me. So you will recall, as of our last Federal Affairs Advocacy Task Force meeting in May, Congress had passed and the President had signed into law 4 pieces of legislation totaling close to $3 trillion in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The first, that was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Bill. Second, the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act. Third, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which became known as the CARES Act. And then lastly, the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act. In mid-May, just after our last call and meeting, the House of Representatives passed another $3 trillion package called the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act, which is now known as the HEROES Act, which has been mentioned several times. on the call. Sort of in a nutshell, the HEROES Act would deliver federal aid to state and local governments, provide rent and mortgage relief, and expand unemployment and food assistance programs. The County of Santa Clara has been clear from the start about communicating its priorities to its congressional delegation, including Representative Khanna, whose representative is on the phone today, as well as Representative Lofgren. Representative Lofgren was instrumental through conversations with us in advocating for direct and flexible funding for counties direct and flexible funding for counties in her conversations with the Speaker's office. So we're very thankful for that. Some of the highlights of the HEROES bill that the county cares about, I'll just touch on several of them. I won't go into any detail. First, there's $500 billion in funding to assist state governments with the fiscal impacts of the public health emergency. Similarly, $375 billion in funding to assist local governments with the fiscal impacts of the public health emergency. $3.6 billion in grants for states for elections for contingency planning and preparation. $10 billion to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program to support anticipated increase in participation and to cover program cost increases related to flexibilities provided to SNAP by the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. $100 million to the Violence Against Women Act programs. $3 billion to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to increase mental health support during this time. $400 million to the Census Bureau for expenses due to delays in the 2020 census. $200 million to the Bureau of Prisons to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus in federal prisons and other associated costs. $5 billion for community development block grants for coronavirus response and to mitigate the impacts to communities. And in addition, the HEROES Act would issue additional stimulus checks and extend the additional $600 per week for unemployment benefits to, I believe, the end of January 2021. And as it has already been discussed, it would aid homeowners and renters by prohibiting eviction filings for 1 year. While the Senate is not expected to take up the HEROES Act itself, it's important to be part of the conversation as to what the next package includes. The Senate is now, as has been mentioned before, not expected to begin negotiations on the next iteration of relief until July. That's all I have for my report on the state of play. I'm happy to gather more or provide more information on some of those items if more detail is needed. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Margolin to discuss some of the healthcare items.
Forgive me. Thank you very much. Mr. Margolin?
Sure. Yes, good morning, Supervisor Smitigan. There are a number of healthcare provisions in the HEROES Act that I'm going to touch on briefly. And the first one involves the effort in the HEROES Act to add $100 billion to the Provider Relief Fund. This is a fund that had already been created in earlier rescue legislation, COVID rescue legislation. It had been funded to the tune of $175 billion in the earlier legislation. The HEROES Act is attempting to add an additional $100 billion to that pot, which Santa Clara County's healthcare system is eligible for and has received funding from. The issue here is not just, though, the total amount of money. There's also an issue here of where the money goes, what the criteria is, and the speed with which the money is being distributed. In the initial distribution, Medicare providers were prioritized. In the next distribution, there was an effort by CMS, the federal government, to change the prioritization to include a broader group of providers, and they used net patient revenue as the key criteria. Both efforts have provoked a lot of controversy because the group that has not been prioritized to date has been Medicaid providers, the population of providers that serves the lowest income members of the society, the most vulnerable, the most impacted by COVID. So just an hour or two ago, an interesting development occurred in Washington in that Frustration over the failure to get the dollars out the door and to actually target Medicaid providers led the 4 members of the 2 key committees in the Congress on a bipartisan basis to send a letter to Health and Human Services Agency, essentially highlighting the failure to get dollars out the door, highlighting their frustration over Medicaid providers not being targeted, and asking by June 10th for a response from the agency as to why this hasn't been done and what the plan is to get this done. This is signed by Senator Grassley, Senator Wyden on the Senate side. It's signed by Pallone and Walden on the House side, bipartisan, ranking member and chairs on both sides. That doesn't happen very often in Washington these days, and it's a reflection of how frustrated members of Congress and others have become over the failure to get these dollars out the door, and also to give them proper targeting, proper prioritization. So in the HEROES bill, not only do you have $100 billion, but you also have an effort by the House to create statutory criteria to ensure that Medicaid providers get more money from this fund, and the money is more appropriately targeted. So that's the latest on the $100 billion in the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act also has an increase in the FMAP rate. This is the matching rate that is utilized by the federal government to put up federal dollars to match state dollars for Medicaid. It would increase the FMAP by 14% for a 1-year time period. Earlier legislation gave us all an increase in the FMAP of 6.2%. This takes it from 6.2% to 14%. The 6.2% FMAP increase contained in an earlier bill gave California $4.5 billion. So you can see that raising it to 14% would more than double that allocation. The $4.5 billion was used by Governor Newsom in his May revise to help plug the budget hole the state is still attempting to fill. And again, a 14% FMAP would do even more to help the legislature and the governor deal with this budget crisis. The HEROES bill also addresses our expiring Medicaid waiver, which is a key issue for us. Lots of money at stake for the county, as we've discussed in the past. The waiver expires end of the year. The original plan by Governor Newsom was to acknowledge that the federal government didn't want to give us a big waiver again, was going to give us a smaller waiver for a lot of technical reasons. And that's why the governor also developed the CalAIM proposal to reform the Medicaid program and find other ways to move dollars into public hospital systems. With CalAIM delayed for a year in the governor's budget, and with the state so overwhelmed with the COVID response that actually negotiating a new waiver with the federal government is more than a challenging enterprise. It's unlikely to be an enterprise that would produce a good result for either side. There's language in the HEROES Act which essentially says if a state like California wants to delay its waiver for a 1-year period, it only has to ask, and that would be done. So the waiver language is important to us. There's also a moratorium on the MFAR rule that's important to Santa Clara County and to the state. This is the proposed rule which would change the way federal dollars are matched in a manner that would make it much more difficult for California and other states to draw down federal revenue. A multi-billion-dollar loss of Medicaid funding is anticipated if the MFAR rule goes forward. The HEROES Act would place a moratorium on MFAR or any similar rule during this period of crisis. And then the last item I'll touch on, major item, is the $75 billion to expand testing and contact tracing. It's a major initiative inspired in part by a bipartisan effort by Slavitt and Gottlieb. Slavitt, the former CMS administrator under Obama, Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner under Trump. They came together and they said essentially, unless there's a massive federal investment in testing and contact tracing, it's just not going to happen. Their proposal was $46 billion. The HEROES Act takes that to $75 billion. The HEROES Act is not that specific about how the money is to be used. It essentially asks states to apply to the federal government for a grant and that's how the money would be distributed. But the underlying Gottlieb-Slavitt proposal was specific and essentially was an effort to give money to the federal government to help the states hire 180,000 new contact tracers. That's the gap that Slavitt and Gottlieb identified. And they also want to create, among other things, a per diem that would be provided to people who are caught up in the contact tracing, who are being told you've been exposed to somebody with COVID, you should isolate for 14 days. This provides a per diem that would be paid by the state through these federal funds of $50 per day as an incentive for people to actually stay home and not go back to work during this isolation period. So those are the major HEROES Act items I wanted to highlight. I want to briefly, before I turn to your question, Supervisor Smitty, and or comments, I want to briefly talk about existing funding that we're waiting for. $11 billion approved in the Paycheck Protection Healthcare Enhancement Act, approved in late April. The $11 billion was approved for testing and contact tracing and other related expenses. There's a provision in that bill that says within 30 days, the federal government has to get this money essentially out the door. And in fact, we think that's happened. There's $500 million of the $11 billion that was identified by Health and Human Services several days ago as being allocated for California. We believe it's been sent to California or is in the process of being transmitted to California. So the question that has been asked by all of us really is, okay, $500 million for testing, contact tracing going to California, how does that get out to the counties that need it to actually make these programs operational on the ground? As of today, we don't have an answer to that. This came out post the May revise, so it's not addressed to the May revise. It's been raised at least one of the budget hearings in Sacramento, but there wasn't really an answer from the state. And there is a testing task force that's also been created by the state to sort of develop a plan. They're aware of this new allocation of federal dollars, and they're also asking members of the testing task force, where are these dollars? How are we going to use them? And there hasn't been an answer provided by the state yet. The state is obligated to provide a plan to the federal government, to Health and Human Services, detailing how they want to use the money that's being provided through this program. That state plan hasn't been sent to Washington yet, hasn't been shared with the legislature yet. We assume the Newsom administration is working on it, so there'll be developments on this front in the days to come. We hope, we believe. There is $500 million for California that's been made available. And we expect that in this budget negotiation with the legislature, there'll be some revelation, some acknowledgement that the money is there and it will be incorporated into whatever the governor's plan ultimately is. That completes my report, Mr. Chair. Happy to respond to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Margolin. Very comprehensive. So I want to try and go back and pull a few particularly important nuggets out, just to make sure I understand them. So the testing and tracing money, and I think you may recall these have been issues of particular interest to me in the past couple of months. The testing and tracing money is at the moment proposed in a piece of legislation which has not yet been enacted, yes?
Well, there's the new testing and tracing money in the HEROES Act, $75 billion, not enacted yet, massive national program, Slavitt Gottlieb model. But there's also $11 billion that was approved in late April, actually a done deal, $11 billion. And the allocation formula was released about a week or so ago by Health and Human Services, and they said California is going to be given $500 million of the $11 billion. And we believe it has been transmitted to California or is about to be transmitted to California pursuant to the law. And the question that the legislature is asking and others are starting to ask is, what's the governor's plan for that $500 million? We haven't gotten an answer yet. So the big $75 billion proposed in HEROES, not approved yet. We don't know what will happen in the negotiation with the Senate and with the president. But the $11 billion with $500 million for California, that's been approved.
Thank you for the distinction. Could you remind me, the $11 billion was approved as part of what legislation previously?
It was approved as part of the Paycheck Protection and Healthcare Enhancement Act.
Thank you. and pursuant to our earlier discussions, I tend to think of this legislation as sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're about to be at 5.0, as I understand it, with HEROES Act. Am I in sync with your way of thinking?
Using your terminology, it was approved in number 4.
Thank you. And then the 75 billion is currently the number in the HEROES Act, but that may or may not pass, and it may or may not pass at that number. Yes,
that is correct. It could be taken out in its entirety. It might pass at a lower figure. Hard to know.
These are significant numbers, even by the time you divide them by 325 million Americans, more or less, and then multiply them by 40 million Californians. You referenced the 500 million in the Paycheck Protection Act. You know, what I always do, Mr. Margolin, even though it's a very crude approximation, is say to myself, well, if Santa Clara County with 2 million people is roughly 5% of the population, what is 5% of that number? And 5% of 500 million, if I'm doing my quick math right today, would be about $25 million. Does that square with your math?
I haven't done the math fully yet. And remember, you're talking about Santa Clara County as 5% of the national population?
No, I'm talking about Santa Clara County with 2 million people.
Oh, as 5% of the state population.
5% of the state.
Right, I was going state to national. So 5%, yes, based upon a population calculation, that sounds right.
All right. Well, my only point here is 25 million devoted to testing and tracing would be it seems to me, Dr. Smith, let me go to you for a moment, if I may, would be a significant boost to our testing and tracing efforts, which are going to be pricey, and which we've all been, you know, working and pushing to step up. To your point, Mr. Margolin, however, we still don't know, because we haven't heard from the state.
Correct.
whether that 25 million that that's my number, not yours, I understand, and it may or may not be the governor's number, which I also understand. That 25 million might be spent directly by the state in our county, or it might be funds advanced to our county for these purposes. But we don't know the answer to that yet, because we haven't seen the governor's plan yet. Yes?
That's all correct.
And if you had a guess, would you hazard one about whether they'd spend it themselves or send it our way? Or is that something that we'll only know when we see the governor's plan?
Since the mandate here is to significantly expand the amount of testing and really build it up and use these dollars to do that, if I was guessing, I would expect that some of the dollars would go to local governments, to counties for their use to scale things up as effectively and as efficiently as possible. But I don't know the answer. It's speculation.
All right. And Dr. Smith, do you have any thoughts or observations about this?
Oh, well, at this very moment in the Finance Committee, the State Department of Finance is stonewalling our effort to straighten out the excess ERAF issues. So based on that approach, I suspect that if it is 25 million, that the state will spend it itself rather than giving any money to the county. But that might be overly negative.
All right. All right. And so timing on the HEROES Act again, and I may go back to the folks at Prime on this, but your best guess about when we will see action on this. It was mentioned in passing, but I'm afraid
the HEROES Act is because the main driving component of the HEROES Act is state relief to deal with state governments that are facing massive shortfalls. The June 30th budget deadline for most states was the driving dynamic. So that's why I think Prime Policy earlier referenced an early July or July 1 likely date for clarity as to what will be available. Of course, state governments, California has a constitutional requirement that we have this balanced budget by June 15th and passed by the legislature. So we're on a more restricted schedule, but a lot of state governments are waiting for this money, but are planning to kind of delay final enactment of their budget until they see what the dollars are. California itself, is having a dispute, the state Senate, on that issue. Governor wanted to have trigger cuts. State Senate has initially responded with the idea that we should defer all cuts until really August, September, when we know what the HEROES Act or its successor means for California financially. So I guess the short answer to your question is we should know something by the end of June, early July. I don't think there's a precise, because of the interest that both blue and red states have in knowing how to close their budgets out.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to this issue of timing and testing, but I see that Ms. Thompson's available, and she may have from Prime. She may have a thought to share about timing on the HEROES Act. Ms. Thompson, are you still with us? I think.
I am. Yes, as we've been canvassing our Hill contacts over the last week, originally we were optimistic that a package might be negotiated in June with a final package to be finished sometime in early July. Internally, we've sort of revised our assessment. The signals that we're getting from Majority Leader McConnell indicate that they will not begin negotiating most likely until July, which as I've said this before, which sort of one, given the fact that the House is out, given the massive unrest and sort of other issues that are going on across the country, it's in some ways intuitively that kind of tracks. I think the question though then is on the back end. If they don't begin negotiations until July, how long will that take, and when are we looking at a final package being completed? So we're definitely at this point looking at sort of more of a July to August timeline.
All right. And Mr. Margolin and Dr. Smith, and forgive me, this is a sort of a step back to just sort of reevaluate where we've been in the context of thinking about where we're headed. It has struck me, Dr. Smith, you will recall almost 3 months ago now at our first meeting in March, which was, I think, our last meeting in our board chambers, I raised the issue of testing and the importance that I attached to it. And at the time, I think you and Dr. Cody were really sort of left with a limited amount you could say on the subject, because we thought that this was a matter of either federal responsibility or independent action by testing labs. Mr. Margolin, it sounds to me like the approach in the HEROES Act is to now acknowledge that the federal government does indeed need to provide at least the funding to stand up testing and contact tracing in some significant way, but then plans to push that responsibility out to the states, and the states will largely accept the responsibility to get it done using federal funds. Is that a fair summary of what we're seeing? I'm trying to, because I attach so much importance to this testing and contact tracing, I'm trying to understand the evolution of thinking, because candidly, 3 months ago, as we talked about in our board chambers, it seemed pretty clear no one was in charge or responsible for testing in a pandemic.
So the point I would make is that the HEROES Act reflects the Democratic majority in the House and their view, and they definitely want to see states and local governments funded and empowered to do testing and to have a very robust national testing program. The fact that they put those dollars in the HEROES Act and the fact that they're promoting and advancing legislation to do that doesn't really change. It hasn't yet changed the dynamic in Washington vis-a-vis the Senate and the administration. I mean, they have not shifted their view, even though we have Slavitt and Gottlieb on a bipartisan basis. And Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner, is an advisor to the president, and therefore people are a bit encouraged that with Gottlieb's involvement, because the president, he does have the president's ear, and Slavitt has credibility in Washington as well, significant credibility with people in the Congress and the administration, there's been some hope here that this may gain traction, but it would involve a shift of perspective about how testing should be handled, and we're not there yet.
Got it. And if I were to ask you, Mr. Margolin, you're an expert on healthcare in America. Who's supposed to be in charge of testing? What would your answer be?
Well, my answer would be that the national government, the federal government, should have the overall plan, and be the general in this battle, in this war that we're fighting. And they should empower states and local governments with adequate funding to implement a national vision for what needs to be done with regional variations.
Excuse the interruption, but if I were to ask you who has been in charge over these last 3, 4, 5 months of testing, what's your answer to that question?
Well, the answer has been the states who have been doing it as best they can with limited resources, and the private sector's weighed in where they can. And there's been guidance from the federal government, but it's been very broad guidance, and the direction that many hoped would be there hasn't been there.
If I had asked somebody in state government a year ago, hey, if we're ever unfortunate enough to have to manage a pandemic on short notice, do you all think you're responsible for testing? What do you think the answer would have been a year ago?
It would have been no, we're not.
Okay. Dr. Smith, thoughts? I know this is a little bit wide ranging, but I'm anxious to see if we can all play some role in bringing clarity to who's responsible for doing what, not only in the current moment, but in the years ahead.
Well, Mr. Supervisor, I obviously don't have my hands on the pulse of what's going on in Washington, but I am really concerned what I've heard from the administration. The president specifically saying at times that he thinks testing is no longer necessary and that basically the pandemic's over. That makes me wonder how he will approach the HEROES Act or whatever its successor is, even presuming that it gets watered down in the Senate. So I think fundamentally, at least in this county, we're going to have to be in charge of our own destiny. We've made significant progress since that meeting that you referred to. I think we will continue to make progress. We're going to have to some extent, rely upon our partners in the private sector to take care of the patients that they're fundamentally responsible for, but we will be the ones in charge for some time. Now, I say that also realizing that the governor and the state have taken the initiative to try to create programs where they will fund testing and tracing, and we will obviously coordinate with them, being an extension of state government in the local area. But I don't see a lot of money coming from the state directly to the county.
Thank you. Let me go to the folks at Prime, if anyone there has any observations, and if not, certainly understandable, but if there are any observations there about sort of Washington, D.C.'s view about who's responsible for testing, if there is such a conventional wisdom. Mr. Mead, if I know it's a bit of a out there question, but if you or your colleagues have any thoughts, happy to hear them.
I would say this. I think that in Washington, I think there's a recognition that the federal government was ill prepared for this pandemic in terms of testing. And I think there is an interest in standing up, a nationwide testing efforts. I think there's some disagreement between the politicians in Washington and the politicians on the state level as to sort of who's leading and who's backing up those efforts. I think there's a little bit back and forth between, the White House and some governors on that. But nevertheless, I think there's just a general recognition that we are lacking capacity and we need to do something about it, although there's some disagreement about how to actually implement it and proceed. And I'll let others on my team chime in on that front.
Before they do, I think I'd like to say with you, Mr. Mead, if I could, and then go to Mr. Margolin. And I do want to try and bring the hearing to a close here in a few minutes, and I want to make sure we don't have anyone left hanging in the queue to speak. Mr. Mead and Mr. Margolin, I've worked with you both a lot, and in pursuing an ever better understanding of how these various systems work. At the risk of stating the obvious, I'm thinking about healthcare coverage and finance, for example. Let's talk about Medicaid just as an example, Medi-Cal in California. Incredibly complicated, important, but there's a very sort of detailed, documented statutory understanding and regulatory prescription about who is responsible for what, who pays for what, who has to match with what, which services are covered, which services are optional, what the federal role is, what the state role is, what the county role is. It just strikes me that that detailed understanding expectation simply wasn't there for pandemic issues. Is that, it's a gross oversimplification, but Mr. Mead, is that more or less accurate?
That's accurate. And it's funny because, not funny, it's just interesting, I'll put it that way, that, back in 2005 and 6, there were calls back then for, we're not prepared. We need to set in motion some efforts to prepare for this kind of a pandemic outcome. And I'll say not enough was done, maybe not very much was done, but no one really heeded those warnings, unfortunately. And so now we find ourselves in the situation we're in, and it's really unfortunate that we've had, and the other thing too, I'll add, is, there's great disparities, around the country and even within states in terms of sufficient levels of testing and sufficient levels of treatment and otherwise. We're seeing, unfortunately, just wide gaps in what there should be and what there is. I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Margolin, again, I'm struck by how, all due respect to you and your colleagues and the folks at Prime and Mr. Margolin, the reason our county hires you is because this stuff is so complex that we need you to help us make our way through the legislative and regulatory path and requirements. And then on this set of issues around testing in a pandemic situation, it just seems as if it's a blank page when we turn to that section of the book. Mr. Margolin? So
you've raised an interesting question. And first of all, I would say that for most disease control issues, counties like Santa Clara have a public health department. And for most of these issues in normal times, it is a local responsibility. You have county public health officers, county public health departments. They do the contact tracing. They surveil for various conditions in the community. They put out advisories. They work with the local provider community. So there is a structure in place to deal with normal times that's heavily rooted in the capacity of local counties and local jurisdictions to have public health departments. Now you have this pandemic, which is a once a century kind of development. We've had other threats, and in fact, the federal government, alarmed by the Ebola threat and by other threats in the early 2000s from other contagious diseases, did begin to ramp up. At least they're planning for a pandemic, but to actually put dollars behind it and work out the details, and it never rose to that level of priority because, again, it isn't part of the recent life and history of our healthcare delivery system. And as you know, Mr. Chair, we've been struggling and battling over the last several years over the basic provision of healthcare to primary care, specialty care, other services to our existing population that we serve. And the financing for that has been a struggle, efforts to pull back and repeal the Affordable Care Act have been a dominant theme in the last few years. So the way the healthcare political expert world has been focused has been on trying to expand coverage and or oppose or resist efforts to pull back on coverage, to find ways to deliver care more cost effectively, to figure out how to expand to new populations. Governor Newsom's budget last year and this year have had these new expansion opportunities. And it hasn't been within sort of the natural order of things for governors and presidents and Congresses to then shift their attention to a once a century kind of development like this. So that the fight we're now having, the criticism that now is going on though about the federal response and the challenge we're facing at the state and county level is, okay, that's history. That's the way it's been in the past. We've got to deal with Medicaid expansion issues, and we've got only so much bandwidth to deal with these issues and so much money. So we haven't dealt with pandemic planning. But 4 months ago, we were forced to confront this ugly reality, and the struggle we're now in, whether it's federal versus state, whether it's House versus Senate, whether it's state versus county, is how do we develop a plan and get the resources organized? And we're doing what would normally be many years worth of work in the space of a few weeks and a few months. And as Dr. Smith indicated, when impasses are reached or resources aren't available, there's no time for people to go back to their neutral corners and complain. You have to get the job done. So Santa Clara County is doing the best it can in an environment where there isn't as much state help as we would like or as much federal help.
All right, thank you very much. Very helpful conversation. We have indicated earlier that we will consider the item number 7 report received. So for the clerk, thank you for that. Mr. Mead, I see your light is on. Did you want to offer one additional comment or no? I'm going to take that silence as a pass. Thank you. And let me go to the clerk. Do we have anyone else queued up who is still waiting to speak when we had to pause the speaker queue earlier in the meeting?
Yes, we have Jason Dorsey.
And is that the only speaker remaining?
And Liz Lacey and Marilyn Mara.
Are those 3 the only ones, Mr. Clerk?
And Marianne and B. Beekman. They have just those 5.
I'm going to ask Mr. Beekman to pass as someone who's already spoken. We will take the other 4, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you very much.
All right.
Go right ahead.
Next speaker is Jason Dorsey. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute, and you will have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Good morning. My name is Jason Dorsey. I'm a general maintenance mechanic here at Santa Clara County. We're working for facilities and fleet. This has been a fabulous conversation, but I want to say that we appreciate that you're working hard to ensure we get as much federal funding as possible. This is all great, but we know the federal funding won't be enough. There has to be a state-based plan. This plan should include the state ability to borrow and find new funding sources to pay off the debt later. California and Santa Clara County cannot leave the destiny in Mitch McConnell's hands. We cannot let Mitch determine what kind of recovery or in our community we want to have. We urge the county to focus more on a state-based plan. California is the 5th largest economy in the world. We can do this. And again, I want to say this has been a fabulous conversation. I've taken more notes in this meeting than I have in any of these meetings. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
Next speaker is Liz Lacey. I'm unmuting you. Please accept the unmute, and you will have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hi, my name is Liz Lacey. Like Jason Dorsey said, this conversation has been very fruitful and very educational in the same sense. There is another idea out there, which is schools and communities first. We need to make sure that we get this on the state ballot. I know that there's a lot of confusion as to what it entails, and that one of the proponents is that this will hurt small businesses. However, that's not so. This initiative provides exemptions for owners of small business properties and for business tangible personal property. So there is a lot to this ballot. And for Santa Clara County, it has the potential of gaining $1.33 billion towards schools and communities. We know that the budget cuts are coming and have been revised on the state budget, and we know that these impact our county. And we're currently working with Dr. Smith and his team, as well as the Board of Supervisors, on lobbying with our team in Sacramento. But we won't fight off specific cuts if we don't make this pie bigger. We will be sending a letter to the governor and legislative leaders today. And we look forward to your support, and we thank you for all of your hard work and dedication. And we have some really tough times ahead. I'm all set. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's go to our next speaker, please.
The next speaker is Marilyn Mara. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you will have 1 minute to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
And a correction, that's 2 minutes to speak, please.
Sorry about that.
Hi, good morning, Board of Supervisors Committee. My name is Marilyn Mara. I'm an SCI public health nurse. As public health nurses continue to work as front lines, performing mass testing, such as in nursing homes, as well as contact tracing, I am continued to be reminded and faced with the reality of disparities. 41% of deaths occur in nursing homes. There are not enough appropriate and sufficient PPEs over there. Board of Supervisors Committee, and they're washing disposable gowns, making face shields with staples. They're using kitchen gloves, and these are the people that have to deal with very high risk populations, which is our elderly. Also, majority of the staff at the nursing homes are overwhelmingly people of color. So we must continue to provide our critical services and more to our communities. All segments in this innovative county, labor, management, schools, faith, private sectors, nonprofit agencies, should be in united coalition to fight for quality of lives of people. Inequities are definitely highlighted more in this pandemic. They need to be addressed, or boiling wages that will pend up will continue to erupt time and time again. Black Lives Matter is in line with social and economic justice. We urge you to be in united coalition with us labor unions, including working on federal and state funding. There is strength in numbers. Let Santa Clara County be the leader and model for California and for this nation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe we have one more speaker. Is that correct? Looking to the clerk to confirm.
Yes, our final speaker is Marianne Waddell. I am unmuting you. Please accept the unmute and you'll have 2 minutes to speak. The timer will start when you begin speaking.
Hi, my name is Marianne Waddell. I am a social worker with the Department of Family and Children's Services. We appreciate everything you have done so far and what you continue to do. We are here because we are in a situation that no one could have imagined. And now COVID-19 has created a financial crisis that not even the best laid plans could have predicted or could help with. We want to be proactive and be a part of the solution to the financial crisis and in how we continue to respond to the public health emergency. Last week, we had members texting voters in Arizona to call Senator McSally and tell her to vote yes for the HEROES Act. We want to know how we can partner with you to ensure we pass federal funding. Please reach out and let us know. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Mr. Pike is still on the call from Congressman Khanna's office. I do want to extend to him the opportunity to offer brief comments, if any. If not, fair enough. But Mr. Pike, thank you again for being with us, and thank you to Congressman Khanna for sharing you with us for these meetings.
Thank you. And as always, thank you for this opportunity, allowing me to convey to Representative Khanna the concerns and perspectives that are presented here today. I understand we're short of time, so I don't want to belabor things, but I did want to thank the county for the letter on the priorities in the HEROES Act and COVID response legislation. Our relevant policy analysts have that and are working on that. Obviously, that's been a huge priority. Also want to thank constituents on this call for expressing their concerns. For example, the rent and mortgage relief issues. Representative Khanna fully supports a universal moratorium on evictions and foreclosures and a mechanism for the federal government to pick up the tab to enact that. There's several pending alternative legislation on that, but one way or another, we'll make sure it proceeds in one form or another. So all of these, I've definitely taken it in. We'll be conveying directly to Representative Khanna. Thanks again for this opportunity, both to the county supervisor staff and also to the constituents. It's very beneficial for us as well. So thank you.
All right. Well, I think with that, we'll say thank you to Mr. Pike and to Representative Khanna. Thank you to you all for your participation today. Our next regularly scheduled meeting is not until September the 2nd. It is entirely possible that we would schedule a special meeting given the state of affairs, but for now, we will adjourn until that September 2nd meeting. With thanks to you all, and a particular thanks and shout out today for folks in the clerk's office who have been really exceptional in making these special meetings work as we adapt to the technology. Thanks again. Take care. We are adjourned.